All right, next up, chapter 24, ecology. We're going to start off by talking about the nature of ecosystems. So ecology is just the study of interactions between organisms and between organisms and their environment. The Earth is considered an ecosystem. There are no sources of new materials outside of the Earth. So many of the materials cycle between organisms and between living and non-living components of the biosphere. Energy is going to come from the sun. It's going to be captured by green plants and then transferred from one organism to another. The biosphere is simply the portion of the earth that contains all living organisms. An ecosystem is a specific area of the biosphere where organisms can interact with one another and with the physical and chemical environment. Biomes. Biomes are a type of terrestrial ecosystem. The climate conditions are going to define those biomes. Climate is going to consist of temperature and precipitation. So the average temperature found there and then the amount of precipitation that falls in that area. Tropical rainforests, savanna, temperate grasslands, deserts, the taiga, the tundra, all of those are going to be divided up and determined by their temperature and precipitation. The aquatic ecosystems are going to be divided into freshwater and saltwater. So freshwater would be things like standing water. There are two types of freshwater ecosystems. Standing water, things like lakes and ponds, and running water, rivers and streams. The richest marine ecosystems are going to lie near the coasts. Coral reefs are going to be located offshore, and salt marshes are going to occur where the river meets the sea. So coral reefs and salt marshes are going to be some of the most rich and diverse aquatic ecosystems. Here is a breakdown of where you're going to find different terrestrial biomes spread across the earth. So we're going to find in very extreme regions, up at the poles, in the northern poles and the southern poles, we're going to find polar ice. Around that area, we're going to find the tundra. Just below the tundra, we're going to find the taiga. Then we're going to see mountain zones. Mountain zones can be spread across quite a few latitudes, but we're going to see that they're really going to be found at specific high elevations. In more temperate regions, we'll find temperate deciduous forests. In wetter regions, we will find temperate rainforests. In drier regions, we'll find temperate grasslands. So anyway, you can kind of spend a little bit of time and look at sort of the breakdown of this globe and how the different latitudes are going to determine the temperature and precipitation for these different biomes. So ecosystems contain both living or biotic and abiotic, non-living components. There are a few examples of abiotic components in an ecosystem would include things like soil, water, weather, climate. All of those are going to be abiotic components of an ecosystem. Biotic components are going to be categorized to how they obtain their energy, whether they are autotrophs or heterotrophs. Autotrophs are going to use inorganic nutrients and an outside source of energy to help produce organic nutrients. So therefore, they are going to be called producers, meaning that they produce food. Great example of this would be algae. Algae carry on photosynthesis in freshwater and marine habitats. Green plants are going to be the dominant photosynthesizers on land. So autotrophs make their own food. Heterotrophs are going to be considered consumers. They have to consume their food. They cannot produce it themselves. They're going to then be broken down further based on their types of food. Herbivores are going to graze directly on the producers. So herbivores consume producers. They are going to consume those plants or algae. Carnivores feed on other animals. Omnivores can feed on both plants and animals. A great example of this would be humans. We eat both plants and animals. There are several levels of consumers in an ecosystem, and the level depends on where the consumer falls in the food chain. So there are primary consumers, so things like plant-eating insects. Herbivores are considered primary consumers. Primary consumers eat producers. Secondary consumers eat primary consumers. So secondary consumers would be like insect-eating frogs. Tertiary consumers are consumers that eat secondary consumers. So in this case, we would have a frog eating a hawk, or frog eating hawks. So in this example, we have plants. Those plants are going to be our producers. The plants are going to be eaten by our primary consumers, the insects. The insects are going to be eaten by the secondary consumers, those frogs. Frogs are going to be eaten by the tertiary consumers, hawks. Here's an example of some of those different categories. Here we have our producers, plants and algae. Here we have our herbivores, insects, and really anything that eats plants. Then we have our carnivores. Here we have 2 levels of carnivores. We have the hawk eating the snake eating the rabbit eating the plants. And then finally, we have our decomposers. Decomposers are not considered producers or are not considered producers. Decomposers cannot make their own food. They have to rely on dead organic material. Decomposers fall into the consumer category. Niche. Niche is going to be a very important part of the ecosystem. It's going to be the role that an organism plays in that ecosystem. So whether they are producers or consumers. So the next thing we really want to break down is energy flow and chemical cycling. There are 2 phenomena that characterize every ecosystem. The energy flow, which begins when producers absorb solar energy, and in some cases they do this through chemical energy, and nutrient cycling. Nutrient cycling is simply when producers take inorganic chemicals from the environment. They then make organic nutrients that can be used by them and others in the ecosystem. Those are going to eventually be broken back down into their inorganic components and returned to the environment. Only some of the nutrients made by autotrophs are going to be passed on to heterotrophs. Plants use some of their fuel for their own cellular respiration. Plants are not making food. They're not making glucose just to make glucose. They're certainly not making glucose just so the consumers can eat them. They are making glucose because they want to use it for their own cellular respiration. So some of the solar energy that plants use is going to be taken up by the plants. It's going to be used to make is going to be used for cellular respiration, and it's going to return some of that energy that's used to make break that glucose down into ATP. Some of that energy is going to be lost to the environment in the form of heat. Consumers are then going to eat those plants. They're going to use some of that energy, some of that material to make their own biomass, but most of that is going to be lost in the form of heat. Decomposers can then break down those consumers. They can break down producers, they can break down consumers. They're going to break them down into their inorganic nutrients, and they're going to return those inorganic nutrients to the soil. But in the process of doing so, all of the remaining energy is going to be given off in the form of heat. So the fate of energy. So a lot of the energy that is taken in by herbivores is going to be given off in cellular respiration. It's going to be given off as heat to the environment. Some is going to be used for growth and reproduction. This energy will be given to carnivores who consume them. In their death or in their excretion or defecation, they are going to give off the rest of this energy in the form of waste materials that can then be returned to the environment as inorganic nutrients through the use of detrivores. Detrivores are going to break down that dead organic material and return it to the environment. All right, so you should be able to explain why autotrophs are called producers, why heterotrophs are called consumers. Explain some of the characteristics that are used to identify biomes, specifically specifically climate. I want you to break down climate into temperature and precipitation and explain how those influence the biome. And then you should distinguish between the movement of energy and the movement of chemicals in the ecosystem. Chemicals are going to cycle, energy is going to flow. We're going to spend quite a bit of time on chemical cycling and energy flow in the next couple of sections, so I don't want you to worry about that right now, but just note that is where this chapter is headed. All right, please let me know if you have any questions, comments, or concerns.